Imagine you are standing on the flight deck of a United States Navy aircraft carrier, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The wind is howling at 30 knots. The sea is churning beneath you, and suddenly you hear it, a sound unlike anything else in military aviation. It is not the scream of a fighter jet. It is not the thump of a helicopter. It is something in between. Something that defies the very laws of what we thought aviation could do. Two massive rotors tilt forward. An aircraft that took off like a helicopter is now flying like a plane. And strapped inside that machine are critical spare parts, classified intelligence packages, high-priority cargo, and sometimes the very pilots who will fly combat missions within hours. This is not science fiction. This is the CMV-22B Osprey. And between 2021 and 2024, this extraordinary machine did something that had never been done before in the history of carrier aviation. It replaced a legend. For over 60 years, the C-2 Greyhound was the workhorse of the United States Navy's carrier onboard delivery system. It was reliable, it was trusted, and it had a reputation built on decades of faithful service. Sailors called it the COD, carrier onboard delivery. It flew mail, it flew people, it flew engines, it flew hope to crews who had been at sea for months. The Greyhound was as much a part of carrier life as flight operations themselves. And yet, by 2021, the Navy had made a decision that shocked many aviation historians, thrilled military futurists, and opened one of the most fascinating chapters in modern naval aviation history. The Greyhound's time was over. And the Osprey, already famous, already controversial, already battle-tested, was coming to the carrier. But here is what most people do not know. This transition was not simply about replacing one aircraft with another. It was about fundamentally rethinking how a carrier strike group is supported. It was about range and speed and capability. It was about what happens when a carrier is operating in a contested environment and a traditional fixed-wing transport simply cannot get there safely. It was about the future of naval power projection in a world where China and Russia are watching every move the United States Navy makes. And it was about one of the most complex, most expensive, and most carefully managed aircraft transitions in recent naval history. A transition that unfolded between 2021 and 2024 with successes, challenges, setbacks, and ultimately, a transformation that will define carrier aviation for decades to come. So today, we are going deep. We are going to walk through every chapter of this story. We are going to understand the C-2 Greyhound, where it came from, what it did, why it mattered. We are going to understand the CMV-22B, what makes it different, what makes it extraordinary, and what makes it unlike anything that has ever landed on a carrier deck before. We are going to examine the decision-making process that led the Navy to choose the Osprey. We are going to look at the operational transition year by year from 2021 through 2024. We are going to talk about the controversies because there were controversies. We are going to talk about the crashes because those happened too, and the Navy and the aviation community had to reckon with them honestly. And we are going to talk about what all of this means for the future. This is a 60-minute journey into one of the most important aviation transitions of the 21st century. And if you are someone who cares about military history, about aviation technology, about strategic naval power, or simply about the sheer incredible achievement of human engineering, you are going to want to stay right here until the very end. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to 1964. The year 1964 was a pivotal moment in American military history. The United States was deepening its involvement in Vietnam. The Cold War was at a simmering, dangerous intensity, and the United States Navy was operating carrier strike groups across multiple oceans simultaneously. The logistical demands of keeping those carriers supplied were enormous. Carriers are not just floating airfields, they are cities at sea. They consume fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, and personnel at a rate that is almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. And getting all of those things to a carrier operating hundreds of miles from the nearest land base was one of the Navy's greatest logistical challenges. Before the C-2, the Navy had relied on a modified version of the E-1 tracer and other aircraft for carrier delivery missions. But these aircraft were limited. They could not carry large enough payloads. They did not have the range that modern carrier operations demanded. The Navy needed something purpose-built, something that could operate from a carrier deck, carry substantial cargo, and make the critical supply runs that kept carrier operations alive. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the legendary Long Island-based manufacturer that also built the F-14 Tomcat, the A-6 Intruder, and the lunar module that landed on the moon, had the answer. They took the wing and tail design from the E-2 Hawkeye, the carrier-based airborne early warning aircraft, and built an entirely new fuselage around it. The result was the C-2 Greyhound, a twin turboprop, high-wing transport aircraft with a rear-loading ramp, capable of carrying up to 26 passengers or 10,000 pounds of cargo. It could operate from a carrier deck, land on a carrier using an arresting wire, and launch from a catapult. And it could do all of this reliably day after day, year after year. The first C-2 flew in 1964. The aircraft entered operational service with the Navy in 1966. And from that moment forward, the Greyhound became the backbone of carrier logistics. It carried jet engines to carriers that had lost power plants to combat damage or mechanical failure. It carried critical spare parts that kept aircraft flying. It carried high-value cargo, classified packages, and VIP passengers, including presidents and secretaries of defense who needed to land on carriers at sea. It carried mail, which may sound mundane, but for a sailor who had been at sea for 6 months, a letter from home carried in the belly of a Greyhound was worth more than almost anything else in the world. The Greyhound was not glamorous. It was not the aircraft that appeared in recruiting posters or Hollywood films. It was not the aircraft that launched off the bow in Afterburner and punched through the sound barrier. But ask any carrier sailor who served between 1966 and 2024, and they will tell you, when that COD was on final approach with the mail and the parts and the replacement crew members, it was the most beautiful aircraft in the sky. The C-2A Greyhound went through a remanufacturing program in the 1980s. The Navy received 39 updated aircraft between 1985 and 1989, extending the service life of the fleet significantly. These remanufactured aircraft would go on to serve for another 3 decades, which was itself a remarkable achievement. But by the 2010s, the writing was increasingly on the wall. The Greyhound fleet was aging. The aircraft were approaching the end of their structural service lives. Maintenance costs were rising, and the strategic environment in which carrier aviation operated had changed dramatically. Think about the world in 2010 compared to the world in 1964 when the Greyhound was designed. In 1964, the primary threat to a carrier strike group operating in the Pacific was relatively limited. Soviet submarines were dangerous. Soviet aircraft were concerning. But the concept of a carrier operating within range of precision land-based anti-ship missiles launched from the Chinese mainland or from Russian territory was not the primary planning scenario. By 2010, that had changed completely. The rise of Chinese anti-access and area denial capabilities, the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, which China publicly claimed could strike a moving carrier at ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers, fundamentally changed the calculus of carrier operations. A carrier operating in a high-threat environment could not afford to have its logistics aircraft operating from forward airfields that were now within range of sophisticated adversary systems. The support network for a carrier strike group had to become more flexible, more distributed, and more capable of operating in contested or denied airspace. The C-2 Greyhound, for all its virtues, had a range limitation that increasingly concerned Navy planners. The aircraft could operate effectively at ranges up to around 1,000 nautical miles from its operating base. In a permissive environment, this was entirely adequate. But as the Navy began planning for potential conflict scenarios in the Western Pacific, scenarios that required carriers to operate at greater distances from traditional shore bases, the range limitation of the Greyhound became a genuine operational concern. And then there was the question of what came next. The Navy had to make a decision. Do you develop a brand new carrier onboard delivery aircraft from scratch? An enormously expensive and time-consuming undertaking? Do you find a modified version of an existing aircraft that could fill the role? Or do you look at what was already in the inventory, already battle-tested, already proven, and ask whether it could be adapted for the carrier mission? The answer the Navy arrived at was the V-22 Osprey. But to understand why that answer made sense and why it was also controversial, you need to understand what the Osprey actually is and what it took to get it to this point. The V-22 Osprey program is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of American military aviation. It is a story of visionary engineering, political battles, budget fights, fatal accidents, congressional investigations, program cancellations that were reversed, and ultimately redemption. The V-22 is a tiltrotor aircraft, a design concept that had been explored by aviation engineers since the 1950s but had never been successfully fielded as a production military aircraft. The basic idea of a tiltrotor is breathtakingly simple in concept and extraordinarily difficult in execution. You build an aircraft with rotors mounted on the tips of its wings. When the aircraft takes off, the rotors point upward, like a helicopter, providing vertical lift. Once the aircraft is airborne, the rotors tilt forward until they are pointing more or less horizontally, like conventional propellers. At that point, the aircraft generates lift from its wings like a conventional fixed-wing aircraft and can fly at speeds and ranges that no helicopter can match. Bell Helicopter and Boeing began developing the V-22 under a joint program in the 1980s. The Marine Corps wanted a replacement for their aging CH-46C Knight helicopters. The Navy and Army also expressed interest in variants of the aircraft. The program received substantial funding and moved forward through the late 1980s with considerable optimism. And then, in 1989 and 1992, the program was shaken by two fatal crashes during development testing. In 1992, a crash during a demonstration flight killed all 7 people on board. The program faced intense congressional scrutiny. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, during his tenure under President George H.W. Bush, repeatedly attempted to cancel the V-22 program, arguing that the money would be better spent on other military priorities. The Marine Corps and their congressional allies fought back fiercely. The program survived. Testing continued through the 1990s. Then, in April 2000, during operational evaluation testing, a V-22 crashed in Arizona, killing all 19 Marines on board. It was one of the deadliest military aviation accidents in years. Investigators found that the crash was caused by a phenomenon called vortex ring state, a condition in which a helicopter or tiltrotor descends too rapidly into its own downwash, causing a catastrophic loss of lift. Later that same year, in December, another V-22 crashed in North Carolina, killing all 4 crew members on board. 2 fatal crashes in the same year. The program was under enormous pressure. There were calls for cancellation from multiple directions. The aviation community was deeply divided about whether the tiltrotor concept was inherently too dangerous to be fielded as a production military aircraft. But the Marine Corps did not give up. Investigators identified the causes of the crashes. Design changes were made. Training protocols were revised. The program continued, and eventually, in 2007, the MV-22B Osprey entered operational service with the United States Marine Corps. Marines deployed to Iraq with the Osprey, then to Afghanistan, then to locations around the world. Over time, as the operational record accumulated, the Osprey demonstrated that it could do things no other military aircraft could do. It could self-deploy across oceans, something that helicopters cannot do without extensive ship support. It could cruise at over 275 knots, nearly twice the speed of the helicopters it replaced. It had a combat radius that gave commanders options they had never had before. It was not perfect, no aircraft is, but it proved itself in combat, and it earned the respect of the crews who flew it. The Air Force developed their own variant, the CV-22B, for special operations missions. And the Navy, watching all of this with considerable interest, began working on the CMV-22B. The C stands for carrier, M for multimission, V for vertical or short takeoff and landing. The CMV-22B was purpose-built for the carrier onboard delivery mission, with modifications that made it specifically suited to operating from a carrier deck. So what makes the CMV-22B different from the Marine Corps MV-22B? This is important, and it is worth spending some time on, because the modifications that were made to create the CMV-22B were not trivial. They reflect the unique demands of carrier aviation and the specific requirements of the COD mission. The most obvious difference is range. The carrier onboard delivery mission requires an aircraft that can fly from a shore base to a carrier operating potentially hundreds of miles offshore, deliver its cargo, and fly back. The standard MV-22B has a combat radius of around 430 nautical miles in assault configuration. For the COD mission, the Navy needed considerably more range. The CMV-22B was equipped with an extended-range fuel system, including additional fuel tanks, giving it a ferry range of over 1,150 nautical miles. This is more than twice the range that the standard Osprey can achieve in assault configuration, and it is significantly greater than the operational range of the C-2 Greyhound it replaced. This range capability is not just operationally useful, it is strategically significant. A carrier operating in a contested environment, keeping its distance from adversary anti-ship missile systems, can still be reliably supplied by a CMV-22B operating from a shore base that is safely beyond the threat envelope. The CMV-22B also features a high-frequency and beyond line-of-sight communication system, which gives the aircraft the ability to communicate over long distances without relying on line-of-sight radio links. This is essential for an aircraft operating at extended range over the open ocean. The aircraft also has a public address system and passenger accommodations suitable for the COD mission, including seats for up to 18 passengers or the ability to configure the cabin for cargo, medical evacuation, or other mission profiles. The cargo capacity is up to 6,000 pounds in the cabin, with the ability to carry outsized cargo that could not fit in the Greyhound's fuselage, including certain aircraft engines that are critical for keeping carrier air wings operational. The carrier compatibility features are also significant. The CMV-22B has a folding rotor wing system. The rotors fold and the wing tilts to reduce the aircraft's footprint on the carrier deck and in the hangar bay. This was a critical design requirement, because space on a carrier is extraordinarily precious. The aircraft has a carrier-compatible approach speed and glide slope that allows it to execute arrested landings on a carrier deck, and it has a catapult launch system interface that allows it to be launched from the carrier's catapults when required. It can also take off vertically or with a short rolling takeoff, giving it operational flexibility that the Greyhound simply did not have. Now, here is something that is genuinely remarkable about the CMV-22B from an operational standpoint. Because the Osprey can take off and land vertically, it does not strictly require a catapult launch or an arresting wire landing in all conditions. This means that in an emergency, the CMV-22B can operate from ships and platforms that do not have catapults or arresting gear, amphibious assault ships, for example, or even improvised landing zones in a contingency scenario. The C-2 Greyhound was tied to carriers with catapults and arresting wires. The CMV-22B has the flexibility to operate from a much wider range of platforms. This is a fundamental expansion of the Navy's logistical flexibility. The program to develop the CMV-22B and transition it into service moved through its development phases during the late 2010s. The first flight of the CMV-22B in its carrier-configured form took place in 2019. Carrier landing qualification tests were conducted. The aircraft demonstrated that it could successfully operate from a carrier deck, launch from the catapult, and land on the wire. The operational test and evaluation process was rigorous, as it always is for carrier aviation. The demands of operating from a carrier deck are among the most extreme in all of aviation, and the Navy does not certify aircraft for carrier operations until they have been thoroughly proven. By 2020, The Navy was moving toward initial operational capability for the CMV-22B with Fleet Logistics Support Squadron 30, known as VRC-30, based at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. VRC-30 is the Navy's primary COD squadron, and it would be the lead unit for the CMV-22B transition. And so we arrive at 2021, the year the transition began in earnest. The year 2021 was, in many ways, the beginning of the end for the C-2 Greyhound in frontline service and the beginning of a new era for naval logistics. The CMV-22B had received its initial operational capability designation, and VRC-30 began operating the new aircraft alongside the remaining C-2 Greyhounds in the fleet. This was not an overnight transition. It was a carefully managed, carefully sequenced process that required training hundreds of aircrew members, developing new maintenance procedures, establishing parts supply chains, and building the institutional knowledge that comes from operating a genuinely new type of aircraft in a demanding operational environment. Training was one of the most significant challenges. The CMV-22B is a fundamentally different aircraft to fly compared to the C-2 Greyhound. The Greyhound is a conventional fixed-wing aircraft. Pilots who fly it train as fixed-wing pilots, using conventional fixed-wing techniques for takeoff, landing, navigation, and emergency procedures. The CMV-22B requires pilots to be proficient in both rotary-wing and fixed-wing flight regimes, because the aircraft operates in both. The conversion mode, the transition from vertical flight to forward flight and back again, requires specific training and situational awareness. The emergency procedures for a tiltrotor are more complex than those for a conventional fixed-wing aircraft. New simulators had to be procured and integrated into the training pipeline. Instructor pilots had to be trained before student pilots could be trained. All of this takes time and it takes resources. Maintenance training was equally important and equally complex. The CMV-22B has a prop rotor gearbox system, the mechanism that tilts the rotors, that has no equivalent in any other carrier aircraft. Maintainers needed specialized training on the tilt rotor system, the prop rotor blades, the nacelle tilting mechanism, and the unique hydraulic systems that control the conversion process. The Navy worked closely with Bell Boeing, the manufacturing consortium, to develop maintenance training programs and to ensure that spare parts and technical support were available. Despite these challenges, 2021 saw steady progress. CMV-22B aircraft were deployed to the Western Pacific with carrier air wing units attached to carrier strike groups. The aircraft flew its first operational COD missions in the Pacific theater, demonstrating the range and payload capabilities that had been promised during the development program. Feedback from fleet crews was generally positive about the aircraft's range and mission flexibility, though there was a natural learning curve as aviators and maintainers built experience on the new type. There is something important to understand about how naval aviation manages transitions like this. When a new aircraft enters service, it does not simply replace the old aircraft overnight. There is always an overlap period during which both the old and new aircraft operate simultaneously. This allows the fleet to build proficiency on the new aircraft, work through the inevitable teething problems that any new aircraft program experiences, and ensure that the mission, in this case carrier onboard delivery, continues without interruption. The Navy cannot simply take the COD fleet offline for a year while the transition happens. The carriers at sea need their logistics support every day. So throughout 2021 and into 2022, the C-2 Greyhound and the CMV-22B operated side by side. Experienced Greyhound crews provided institutional knowledge and continuity. New CMV-22B crews built their flight hours and their confidence on the new aircraft. The two aircraft types represented, in a very tangible way, the bridge between the old era of carrier aviation logistics and the new one. The year 2022 brought accelerated transition activity, and it also brought a moment of tragedy that would cast a shadow over the entire CMV-22B program. In November 2022, a CMV-22B Osprey assigned to the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln went down in the Philippine Sea during flight operations. The crash occurred during what was described as a mishap while the aircraft was attempting to land on the carrier. All 5 crew members on board were killed. It was a devastating loss, and it triggered an immediate safety investigation and a temporary pause in some CMV-22B flight operations while investigators worked to determine the cause. The investigation focused on several potential factors, including the sea state and weather conditions at the time of the crash, pilot workload during the carrier approach, and the performance of the aircraft systems. The crash was a painful reminder that carrier aviation is an inherently demanding and dangerous endeavor, and that the introduction of a new aircraft type, even one that has been carefully tested, always carries risk during the operational transition period. The Navy's response to the crash was what you would expect from an institution with a deeply ingrained aviation safety culture. Operations were paused. Investigators were dispatched. Data was gathered and analyzed. The findings of the investigation were used to update training procedures and to review whether any modifications to aircraft procedures or systems were required. The Navy was transparent about the fact that the crash was a tragedy and that understanding its causes was essential to preventing future accidents. Flight operations eventually resumed with enhanced procedures and heightened attention to the specific challenges of CMV-22B carrier operations. It is worth noting here that this kind of safety response, pausing operations, investigating, learning, updating procedures, and resuming with enhanced safeguards, is exactly how mature aviation safety systems are supposed to work. The history of aviation is full of accidents that led to improvements that ultimately saved many more lives than were lost. The naval aviation safety system has been refined over decades and is one of the most sophisticated in the world. The response to the November 2022 crash reflected that maturity. 2022 also saw continued progress in the broader transition program. More CMV-22B aircraft were delivered to the fleet. VRC-30 continued building its complement of aircraft and qualified crews. A detachment of CMV-22Bs deployed with a carrier strike group to the Middle East, demonstrating the aircraft's ability to operate in a different theater from the Pacific. The range and speed of the CMV-22B proved their value in this deployment, with the aircraft making logistics runs that would have required multiple trips or different routing by a C-2 Greyhound. By the end of 2022, the Navy had made substantial progress on the transition, but the C-2 Greyhound was still in active service, and the retirement timeline for the older aircraft had been carefully managed to ensure that the CMV-22B fleet was large enough and its crews experienced enough to take over the full mission. The year 2023 was, in many respects, the defining year of the transition. This was the period during which the balance shifted definitively from the Greyhound to the Osprey. The Navy's plan called for the CMV-22B to fully assume the carrier onboard delivery mission, and 2023 saw the final C-2 Greyhound aircraft begin the process of retirement from frontline COD service. Ceremonies were held at Naval Air Station North Island and at other Navy installations to mark the retirement of individual aircraft, events that were genuinely emotional for the naval aviation community, because the Greyhound had been part of carrier life for so long that its retirement felt like the end of an era. Former Greyhound aircrew members gathered to share memories and pay tribute to an aircraft that had served faithfully for decades. Veterans of the Vietnam era who had flown early C-2s rubbed shoulders with younger aviators who had flown the most recent versions of the aircraft. There was pride in what the Greyhound had accomplished, and there was a natural nostalgia for an aircraft that had become such an integral part of carrier culture. But there was also, among most of the naval aviation community, an understanding that the transition to the CMV-22B was the right decision for the right reasons. The CMV-22B, meanwhile, was building an operational record in 2023. The aircraft was deployed across multiple carrier strike groups. It operated in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Crews were accumulating flight hours and building the kind of experience that makes an aviation unit truly proficient. Maintenance teams were developing the institutional expertise to keep the aircraft flying with high mission availability rates. The supply chain for spare parts was maturing. The training pipeline was producing qualified crews at a steady rate. One of the aspects of the CMV-22B's 2023 operations that particularly impressed naval planners was its performance in high-demand, time-critical delivery scenarios. The aircraft's ability to fly directly from a shore base to a carrier at extended range, without the need for intermediate stops, compressed the delivery timeline for critical parts and high-priority cargo in ways that had real operational consequences. When a carrier air wing is waiting for a replacement engine for an F/A-18 Super Hornet, every hour that engine sits on the ground at a shore base is an hour that the Super Hornet cannot fly. The CMV-22B's speed and range meant that the time between a critical part being ready for pickup at a shore installation and that part arriving on the carrier was measurably shorter than it had been with the Greyhound. This kind of operational efficiency has a direct impact on the combat power available to a carrier strike group. There was also, in 2023, growing appreciation within the fleet for the CMV-22B's versatility. Because the aircraft can take off and land vertically, it can operate from a carrier even when catapult or arresting gear systems are temporarily out of service, situations that occasionally arise due to mechanical issues or battle damage. This operational resilience is exactly the kind of capability that naval planners value in a high-threat environment. An aircraft that can only operate under ideal conditions is far less valuable than an aircraft that can operate under degraded conditions. By the end of 2023, the transition was substantially complete. The C-2 Greyhound had effectively retired from frontline COD service, though a small number of aircraft remained in limited service for training and support purposes. The CMV-22B had assumed the primary carrier onboard delivery mission for the United States Navy. The transition that had been planned, debated, and executed over a period of years had reached its operational conclusion. The new era of carrier logistics had arrived. And then came 2024, the year of consolidation and, tragically, of additional grief. In 2024, the CMV-22B community was focused on continuing to refine operations, improve readiness rates, and build the deep institutional knowledge that only comes from sustained operational experience. VRC-30, the primary COD squadron, was fully equipped with CMV-22B aircraft. Detachments deployed with carrier strike groups to all the Navy's operating areas. The aircraft was, by any operational measure, performing the COD mission successfully. But 2024 also brought renewed attention to Osprey safety concerns that extended beyond the Navy's CMV-22B. In November 2023, just before the end of the year, a CV-22B Osprey operated by Air Force Special Operations Command had crashed off the coast of Japan, killing all 8 crew members on board. The investigation into that crash focused on a mechanical failure in the prop rotor gearbox system, specifically a condition called a hard clutch engagement, in which the clutch system that connects the engine to the prop rotor gearbox can fail catastrophically under certain conditions. This finding had implications not just for the Air Force's CV-22B fleet, but for all V-22 variants, including the Navy's CMV-22B. In the wake of the Japan crash investigation findings, the Department of Defense ordered a fleet-wide safety review of all V-22 Osprey variants. The review examined the prop rotor gearbox issue and its implications for flight safety. All V-22 variants, including the CMV-22B, faced operational restrictions while the review was conducted. The CMV-22B community, which was already sensitive to safety following the 2022 Philippine sea crash, found itself once again navigating the difficult space between operational necessity and flight safety concerns. The Navy worked closely with Bell Boeing and with the other V-22 operating communities to understand the scope of the gearbox issue and to determine what corrective actions were required. Inspections were conducted on CMV-22B aircraft. Operational restrictions were put in place limiting certain flight regimes and conditions that were associated with elevated risk of hard clutch engagement events. The restrictions had an impact on operational tempo, as they limited the conditions under which CMV-22B aircraft could fly and required additional maintenance inspections. These events were deeply challenging for the CMV-22B community and for the broader V-22 program. Critics of the Osprey pointed to the accumulated accident record and questioned whether the program's safety issues were fundamental to the tiltrotor design rather than addressable through engineering modifications and improved procedures. Defenders of the program pointed to the aircraft's extraordinary operational capabilities and argued that the safety issues, while serious and requiring urgent attention, were being addressed through rigorous investigation and corrective action. The debate about Osprey safety is one that deserves honest engagement because it is not a simple debate. The V-22 program has had a higher fatal accident rate per flight hour than some comparable aircraft types. That is a fact, and it cannot be dismissed. At the same time, the V-22 operates in demanding environments, executes complex missions, and pushes the boundaries of what aviation technology can do in ways that increase risk exposure. The Marine Corps' MV-22B, for example, has operated in combat environments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Africa in conditions that would not be asked of most transport aircraft. The comparisons are not straightforward. What is clear is that the Navy, in 2024, was deeply committed to resolving the safety issues with the CMV-22B and to ensuring that the aircraft could operate with an acceptable level of risk. The operational restrictions imposed in the wake of the Japan crash investigation were seen as temporary measures, necessary in the short term, but intended to be lifted as engineering solutions were implemented and as the fleet demonstrated that the risk factors had been addressed. Bell Boeing and the Department of Defense worked throughout 2024 on engineering modifications and procedural changes aimed at reducing the risk of hard clutch engagement events across the V-22 fleet. Even amid these challenges, the CMV-22B continued to perform the carrier onboard delivery mission throughout 2024. Operational restrictions limited some activities, but the aircraft continued to fly, continued to deliver cargo and personnel to carriers at sea, and continued to demonstrate the range and speed advantages that had made it the Navy's choice to replace the Greyhound. The COD mission, keeping carriers supplied, keeping carrier air wings operational, continued without interruption. By the end of 2024, the transition from C-2 Greyhound to CMV-22B was fully complete. The Greyhound had retired from frontline service. The CMV-22B was the Navy's carrier onboard delivery aircraft, and it would carry that responsibility forward into the future. The period from 2021 to 2024 had seen not just an aircraft transition, but a fundamental transformation in the way the United States Navy thinks about and executes carrier logistics. Now, let us step back and look at the bigger picture. What does this transition actually mean for naval power and for the future of carrier aviation? The strategic significance of the CMV-22B transition goes beyond the capabilities of any single aircraft. It represents a broader shift in how the Navy thinks about operating in contested environments against sophisticated adversaries. The concept of distributed maritime operations, spreading naval forces across a wider area to complicate adversary targeting and reduce vulnerability to precision strike weapons, requires logistic systems that can reach widely dispersed forces efficiently. The CMV-22B's range and speed are better suited to supporting distributed operations than the Greyhounds were. An aircraft that can fly 1,000 nautical miles, deliver critical cargo to a carrier or to a surface combatant operating in a remote location, and return to base without requiring forward-basing infrastructure is a significant enabler of the distributed operations concept. The CMV-22B also represents a capability that goes beyond simple cargo delivery. The aircraft's versatility, its ability to operate as a personnel transport, a medevac platform, a search and rescue asset, a special operations support aircraft, and a logistics carrier, makes it a multi-mission asset in a way that the Greyhound never was. Naval planners can use the CMV-22B in ways that were not possible with a conventional fixed-wing transport. This flexibility has real value in a complex operating environment where mission requirements change rapidly and where the ability to quickly reorient an asset from one mission to another can make a decisive difference. There is also the question of how the CMV-22B fits into the broader future of carrier aviation. The carriers themselves are evolving. The Ford-class carriers, the Navy's newest and most capable carriers, are equipped with an electromagnetic launch system and advanced arresting gear, different from the steam catapults and older arresting gear on the Nimitz class. The CMV-22B has been certified for operations from Ford-class carriers as well as Nimitz-class carriers, ensuring that the COD mission remains viable across the entire carrier fleet as the older Nimitz-class ships are eventually retired. Looking further into the future, the CMV-22B program is expected to serve the Navy through at least the 2040s. The aircraft will be the backbone of carrier logistics for the next 2 decades. In that time, the Navy will continue to refine how it employs the aircraft, continue to address the safety challenges that have accompanied the Osprey program throughout its history, and continue to develop the tactics and procedures that maximize the CMV-22B's unique capabilities. The legacy of this transition will be felt in ways that are both tangible and intangible. The tangible legacy is straightforward. Carriers will be able to operate at greater range from logistics bases. The COD mission will be executed with greater speed and flexibility, and the Navy's ability to support carrier operations in contested environments will be enhanced. The intangible legacy is harder to quantify but no less important. The successful, if sometimes painful, transition from the Greyhound to the Osprey demonstrates the United States Navy's ability to embrace new technology, manage complex programmatic challenges, learn from setbacks and accidents, and ultimately field a capability that serves the national interest. That institutional capacity for adaptation and transformation is itself a strategic asset. There is one more dimension of this story that we have not yet fully explored, and it is one of the most human dimensions of all. The people who flew the C-2 Greyhound, the people who maintained it, the people who loaded it with cargo and unloaded it on carrier decks, the people who received the mail and the spare parts and the replacement crew members it delivered, these people are part of the story too. The transition from the Greyhound to the Osprey was not just a programmatic event. It was a human event. It meant that pilots who had built their careers flying the Greyhound had to transition to a fundamentally different aircraft, or retire, or find other assignments. It meant that maintainers had to learn new skills and new systems. It meant that the culture around the COD mission, the traditions, the call signs, the informal rituals that build community in an aviation unit had to evolve and adapt. The naval aviation community is extraordinarily good at honoring its history while embracing its future. The retirement ceremonies for the C-2 Greyhound were genuine expressions of respect and gratitude for an aircraft that had served faithfully. At the same time, the aviators who flew those retirement ceremonies were often the same people who were learning to fly the CMV-22B, who were excited about the new capabilities the Osprey brought, and who were proud to be part of the next chapter in the story of carrier aviation. Both things can be true simultaneously. Deep respect for what came before and genuine enthusiasm for what comes next. This is, in many ways, the story of the United States Navy itself. It is an institution with a history measured not in years but in centuries. It has an identity deeply rooted in tradition and in the pride of service. And yet, it has consistently demonstrated the ability to transform itself when transformation is necessary. From sail to steam, from battled wagons to carrier aviation, from conventional fixed-wing COD to tiltrotor, the Navy has always found a way to adapt. The CMV-22B Osprey is not just an aircraft. It is a statement about where naval aviation is going. It is evidence that the United States Navy understands the strategic environment it operates in and has made the decisions necessary to remain the world's most capable maritime fighting force. It is a tribute to the engineers at Bell Boeing who spent decades perfecting a technology that seemed impossible. It is a tribute to the test pilots who took enormous personal risk to certify the aircraft for carrier operations. It is a tribute to the maintenance crews who wake up before dawn to have the aircraft ready for its missions. And it is a tribute to the crews who fly it, who take off from carriers in the middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Arabian Sea, climb to cruise altitude, tilt those rotors forward, and fly toward a shore base hundreds of miles away to pick up the cargo that keeps the carrier's mission going. The C-2 Greyhound served with honor for more than 5 decades. It flew in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in 100 operations that never made the headlines but were essential to the outcome of events that did. Every time a carrier air wing launched to execute a combat mission, there was a good chance that a Greyhound had delivered something critical in the days or weeks before that made the mission possible. The Greyhound's contribution to American naval power was immense, and it deserves to be remembered. And now the CMV-22B carries the mission forward. It is a different aircraft capable of different things, operating in a different world than the one the Greyhound was born into. But the mission is the same. Get the right stuff to the right place at the right time so that the carrier can do its job. It is one of the most important logistics missions in the United States military. And from 2021 to 2024, the Navy executed one of the most significant aviation transitions of the 21st century to ensure that mission continues to be executed with excellence for decades to come. The next time you see footage of a carrier strike group operating somewhere in the world's oceans, projecting power, deterring adversaries, reassuring allies, remember that somewhere nearby, a CMV-22B is in the air. Those massive rotors tilting between vertical and horizontal. That distinctive sound that is like nothing else in aviation. Carrying the mail and the parts and the people that keep the carrier going. Carrying the invisible thread that connects a city at sea to the world it serves. The Greyhound is gone from the front line. The Osprey has taken its place. And the mission, the endlessly important, endlessly demanding, endlessly vital mission of keeping the carrier alive, goes on. Now here is what I want to ask you, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Given everything you have heard today, the capabilities, the challenges, the accidents, the strategic rationale, the human stories, do you think the United States Navy made the right decision replacing the C-2 Greyhound with the CMV-22B Osprey? Was it the right aircraft at the right time for the right reasons? Or do you think the Osprey's safety record raises questions that should have led the Navy to pursue a different solution? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Tell me what you think. This is a conversation worth having, and every perspective matters. And if you found this deep dive valuable, if you learned something today that you did not know before, do one simple thing: hit that subscribe button. Because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about the aircraft, the ships, the people, and the decisions that shape the world's most powerful military force. You do not want to miss them.